Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And watching President Trump sit so close to President Obama this morning in the cathedral, could only wonder what would have happened if President Trump had followed President Obama's advice about not hiring Michael Flynn. Yeah. Where would the Trump presidency, where would the Mueller investigation be today? Would there be a Mueller investigation today?
Well, and it is remarkable given, I mean, we now, with a couple of years distance, we now know more about the interactions between President Obama and President-elect Trump at the time. And it wasn't like Obama was giving him a piece of his mind and telling him, how he should govern and what he should do in terms of policy and everything. He seems to have basically come to him with two things, like the North Korea thing is way more serious than you might think it is, A, and B, the only other thing I'm giving you advice about is don't hire Mike Flynn. We can debate how he dealt with A, but B is absolutely turned out to be something that may end up being the dominant story of his presidency when its obituary is finally written.
Yeah, and possibly the single worst decision he made as president-elect, choosing Michael Flynn as his national security advisor.
We will find out.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Well, today in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., at the state funeral of George H.W. Bush, 5 presidents sat in the front row. And from the altar, one of them was told that he is corroding, rotting away inside.
He never hated anyone. He knew what his mother and my mother always knew. Hatred corrodes the container it's carried in. The most decent and honorable person I ever met was my friend George Bush, one of nature's noblemen.
Hatred corrodes the container it's carried in. And there, sitting in front of former Republican Senator Alan Simpson in the front row, is a man who is nothing but hatred, filled with hatred. In Alan Simpson's view, a corroding container of a man. When Donald Trump's time comes and he is being remembered by people gathered in a cathedral, no one, not one person, will step up to the microphone and say he never hated anyone. No one will step up and say he was the most decent and honorable person I ever met. No one will say he was one of nature's noblemen. No one will say that. I know Alan Simpson. I worked with him when I was on the Democratic staff in the United States Senate, and he was one of the most reasonable Republicans with whom we mostly disagreed on policy, but worked with every day. Alan knew that by saying George Bush never hated anyone, and by saying hatred corrodes the container it's carried in, his words would be interpreted as a direct reference to Donald Trump. Alan Simpson knew that his words would be taken as praise for George Bush and at the same time as condemnation for the president who has publicly spewed more hatred than any president in history. Donald Trump had to take his seat in the front pew of the National Cathedral today, the day after Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller revealed some of the reasons why he is recommending no prison time for Donald Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who has pleaded guilty to 1 count of lying to the FBI. The Trumps had to sit beside the Obamas in that front row today. The only time that Donald Trump and Barack Obama sat as close together in a private conversation was when President Obama invited President-elect Trump into the Oval Office, and when the door was closed, President Obama warned Donald Trump not to hire Michael Flynn as his national security advisor. Donald Trump had to sit in that front row today with the other presidents, with Donald Trump drowning in the countless humiliations he has brought upon himself as president, including recurring proofs that he is the most ignorant president in history. Donald Trump had to sit there in the front row of the National Cathedral, covered in the humiliation he has earned thanks to Stormy Daniels' description of his pursuit of her and the federal criminal case in which Donald Trump is named as an unindicted co-conspirator for arranging illegal payments to Stormy Daniels. It's which of Donald Trump's many humiliations weighs on him the most. But today, sitting in that front row with President Obama, on a day when Michael Flynn is once again dominating the headlines, it must have been extra painful for Donald Trump that Barack Obama was sitting in the "I told you so" position on Michael Flynn. Where would the Trump presidency be today if Donald Trump was smart enough to have followed Barack Obama's advice and not hire Michael Flynn?